Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse through the entire Bible. We are currently in Genesis chapter 2. We started from the beginning. We're going to go from Genesis all the way to Revelation. So it's going to be, of course, kind of a long journey. However, starting from the beginning, and which, as I said before, just by way of reminder, we are taking our time in the first 11 chapters because there's so much to unpack by way of understanding what happened in the beginning. And really, Genesis, the word Genesis itself means beginnings, but there are a lot of beginnings in Genesis, and we'll get really a foundational look at what God intended, and then we'll get a foundational look in terms of what happened, then the result of what we're dealing with even today. So Genesis, the book of beginnings. Now, chapter 1, of course, we dealt with the 6 days, the first 6 days of creation. And then day 6 was why God created the heavens and the earth, and that is for man. So one of the things we have when we look at Genesis chapter 1, you see God creating the 6 days. You see the details of the 6 days. And then now in chapter 2, he's going to kind of go back and just zero in on certain points, mainly man's purpose in what God created. He's going to amplify some of the details of this creation of man, the purpose. This is the intent. This is what God had intent. Now, fortunately, chapters 1 and 2 is, a look at before sin, man's sin. Our experience, the totality of our experiences after man sinned. So this is only kind of a glimpse, but it is a very fascinating story of God's, what he created. So I want to go back and start reading verse 1, and then we'll go through, and then we're going to end up. Now, we're going to talk about God's intent for man, God's intent for marriage, the wife. Okay, that's why I said we're going to take our time going through this. Firstly chapter 2, but also the first 11 chapters, because again, there's so much to unpack. So much to unpack. All right. Let me go back. I'm going to read. I'm going to go back to I'm going to go back to Genesis 1 verses 27, and then I'm going to come and read on through chapter 2. All right. So this is chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man. Now this would be day 6 of creation. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. Subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, let every creature that crawls on the earth." God also said, "Look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This food will be for you, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it. I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw all that he made, that it was very good. Evening came, and then morning, the 6th day. So that's completing the 6 days. Now, that said, when we get into chapter 2, he's going to kind of go back and just amplify and zero in on certain certain aspects of the creation that he wants to highlight. Meaning this, chapter 2 is talking about God's intended purpose for man. Okay, so chapter 2, again, verse 1. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. By the 7th day, God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from his work of creation. Now, in the last study, we dealt with the whole Sabbath day. What does it mean for God's rest? Okay, in other words, God wasn't sitting down catching his breath, that he completed. The term rest means that God is now entering into the fruits of his labor, enjoying the fruits of his labor, and that's really what the intent of rest is. So the Sabbath rest was to enjoy. And so even if you want to put the 7-day work week or the 7-day week and then 6 days work and then the 7th-day rest, the concept of the Sabbath was to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Now, because of what sin did, it also becomes, this day of rest becomes a time where you recoup. And we do need that. We know if you work nonstop, you will break down. You will eventually break down. Okay. So verse 4, it says, now these are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation at the time that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So now, again, he's just going to now highlight certain details. Now, this is not a retelling of the story. This is not, let me say this because, again, you may or may not, I think eventually you're going to come across certain critics, Bible critics, that will make their way into mainstream media. One of the criticism is that they try to say that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 contradicts each other because it's telling two different creation stories. Not at all. What you have is the telling of the story in chapter 1, and then the highlighting of certain details in chapters 2. Now, you kind of see, we'll see that throughout other chapters in the Bible, where you come in, you'll say, in a broader sense, point A, point B, and point C, and then you want to go back and just kind of highlight certain points out of that. This is all that's going on here. So verse 4 again, these are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation at their time. The Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Really, verse 4 is sort of closing out. Okay. Now, if you even notice here with my poster here, this is coming out of the Bible that I read. And so you see the headlines: man and woman in the garden. Okay, of course that's just the heading that the Bible translators put in. And as I said before, these things oftentimes chapter headings and verses are not inspired. They are not inspired. They were added many centuries later. In fact, in this case, some 15 centuries later is when the English translations began to come and the printed Bible began to come. Okay, these verses and headings were added at that time, and in some cases, I don't know what the heck some of these Bible translators were even thinking. And this is a good example right here, is that really the next thought should start at verse 5, because verse 4 sort of caps off Genesis chapter 1. In other words, chapter 1 should end at chapter 4. Okay? It should end at chapter 4. Alright, but anyway, that's why I said too, when you read Learn to kind of read what closing out the thought of the time. All right, verse 5 says, no shrub of the field had yet grown in the land, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not made it rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. So again, he's kind of coming back, remember, and this is the time when you can almost say, looking at a house, right? A house that is just built. And then you're going to say, well, okay, when you look at a house that's just built, paint's just on, the carpet's in, everything is done, but there's no furniture moving in, there's no TVs, things like that, there's no plants, pictures, but just a kind of house. All right. You notice he says that he says there is no man to work the ground, and we get to that in a moment, or later, I should say. No shrub or field that yet grown. Why? Because notice he said, for the Lord had not made it rain. Verse 6, but water would come out of the ground and water the entire surface of the land. Now, this is kind of interesting here. He's not saying that even during Adam's time that it would not have rained. It seems to indicate that you didn't need to have rain. When God created the earth, he created what we know now as the hydrological cycle. So you go back to Genesis when he separated the water and created an expanse, or we may call clouds or heavens. Now, you know, even now up in the clouds, there is moisture, right? The earth is some 65 to 70% submerged in water. So you have kind of three things going on with water. There's the water in the heavens, or this clouds. Then there's the water, what we call surface waters, oceans, seas, lakes, rivers. And then you have the underground water. Now, underground water, pretty much all of the land, most of the land is saturated underground. Just underground aquifers, okay? So that, and then there's a cycle. When it rains, right? When it rains, the water is either going to sit in oceans, the lake, and the rivers, and then, but on the land part, water seeps into the ground. Now, just for example, if I can go right out of my backyard, and if I dig down in this region where I live at, I could probably dig down some 30 and 40 feet, and I'm going to hit underground water. The ground is literally saturated. Many cities, that's why they use well water. Okay. Now you may ask, wow, why are you going to that? Well, I'm indulging myself. I am a Class A water operator for the state of Illinois, so that's how I know a little bit about some of these things right here. I had to kind of study extensively to be certified for that, and it was a fascinating study until the times that I studied it, didn't even know how these things work right here. But of course, God created this system that would water, wind. Now, thank God for these things, right? Could you imagine? If there was no air movement? When God created the earth and pressurized it, so again, the creation is wonderful. And as I told you before, there are some humanistic science, okay, that try to say, oh, this creation, no big deal. Man, no big deal. No, it's a big deal. When you think about when the thought that God put into this, right? So you got this planet, and by the way, no other planet fits this description. All right, but so I believe the ground pressure is something like 14.7, something like that. We have pressure here. You have this whole system, this weather, weather system. air movement. And just think for a moment, if you did not have air movement. Just think about that for a moment. Just think, if you didn't have air movement, how bad would the stench be? Just think about that, right? One of the things I kind of appreciated about the COVID-19, and man, he wore masks. You have to worry about breath mints, okay? I get it right. But just think about no air movement. Well, God thought about these things, okay? So it's unclear in terms of how, if it would ever have rained during Adam. Remember, we're looking at this from before the sin, so the earth in its purest form, before sin, and we cannot even conceive of that. There was no pollution. There was no disease floating around. There was no all of these things that we just didn't have them. They wouldn't have existed anyway prior to, from our perspective in our study, Genesis chapter 3. But you see this kind of irrigation system that God had, so that the earth, the plants would have gotten watered. Okay, they would have gotten watered through sort of some type of irrigation, ground irrigation. Now again, plenty of water in the ground. There's certain regions in the earth, in the country, in our country, and of course around the world, you can't get to water. Like for example, deserts. Deserts. I don't, desert areas like that. Groundwater is just not there. Where I live at, there's plenty of groundwater. In fact, if I had the money, I could probably put my own water system in, purified water. Not hard, but I do digress. So at this point here, there is no groundwater, and then the indication also seems to be that God had not done it yet. In other words, God, let's go back and read this here. When he says, verse number 5, he says, no shrub of the field had yet grown on the earth, no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not made it rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. So in other words, the indication here seems to be that God kind of held off shrubberies, and the growing of the vegetation, the growing of plants. Why? Man had not yet happened here, so therefore there was just a sort of ground irrigation to kind of keep the land, fertilized, whatever. But so the point is that, in other words, at this point now, we're going to, in the next study, we're going to get into now the formation of man, and then the purpose of it, and then we're going to get even further into, again, talking about the intent of marriage. All right, guys, I will see you in the next study. I'll see you then.